As we've already heard, most of Isabella's biographers touch on her connections with the Advent to a greater or lesser extent, and so I won't belabor details here that are readily available elsewhere, except if they have a direct impact on the day-to-day. So, for example, it is well known that the funeral services of both Jack and Isabella took place here, and that the same hymns were sung at both funerals. We will sing those same hymns at the choral evensong with which our day will end today, and all of the other music in that service is period appropriate, which is to say it is music that was known to be in the repertoire during Isabella's lifetime, and which she might therefore have heard either here or elsewhere. We know that Mr. and Mrs. Gardner started worshipping at the Advent in the 1870s, and that she in particular became heavily involved in the life of the parish. She was part of the Flower Guild and the Altar Guild, and, quote, personally looked after, end quote, the remodelling of the rector's office in 1891. It's unclear what the rector had to say about this. Some things never change, Father Alistair. Modelling it after, quote, an old painting of St. Jerome's study, end quote. That story comes from the History of the Parish by Betty Hughes Morris, where unfortunately it's not footnoted or referenced. So other than it being there, I don't know where that comes from. I do think, however, that Morris is likely correct in her debunking of the myth that Isabella scrubbed the Brimmer Street steps barefooted as a Lenten penance, not least because, as we've heard, her confessors were Cowley fathers and not clergy of the Church of the Advent, and therefore if there was any scrubbing of steps to be done, it probably wouldn't have been here, but that's by the by. Morris suggests, I think correctly, that this myth has its origins in the very proper and traditional ritual of scrubbing the high altar during part of the Maundy Thursday liturgy. That's a custom and a tradition that continues here to this day. What that does begin to show, however, is that over the years, many traditions about Isabella and her involvement here at the Advent have arisen, and it is sometimes difficult to ascertain what is verifiable truth, or complete fantasy, or lies somewhere in between. I'll give some examples of that in just a moment, but I will begin on ground which we know to be somewhat firmer. The title of my paper comes from a passage in Douglas Shantucci's biography of Isabella, although for once the purple prose is not his own. Shantucci is quoting from Ellery Sedgwick's The Happy Profession, which he, Sedgwick, insists is not an autobiography, but rather snapshots from his life, quote, the record of many scenes and many people, not without interest, end quote. And one of these people was, of course, Isabella Stewart Gardner. And the passage that Shantucci quotes is the famous one outlining Isabella's love of beauty. There was no sacrifice she would not make to beauty. She would go without her carriage. She would live on the top floor of her palace, almost on a diet of herbs. But the magical canvas, the inspired bust, the glass of Chartres, the ruby that men must have died for, and the 3 great ropes of pearls which hung to her waist, these things she enjoyed, she adored, and out of the fullness of her joy would thank God for them, and in his holy name make offering to his church of the intricate loveliness of a marble Reredos. Sedgwick does not name the Church of the Advent as the recipient of this benefaction, but there is no doubt at all that Shantucci is correct in his identification. Correspondence about the gift survives, and of course the screen itself stands in the church as a towering memorial to its donor. Shantucci says, the Advent Reredos uniquely offers the viewer today the chance to stretch his or her mind so as to try and compass Gardner's own imaginative reach, perhaps seeing, as I think Gardner did, in the vivid and stately medieval pageantry of a choral high mass swirling before and beneath her Advent Reredos, a Gothic spectacle that was something of a parallel to the more classical pageantry and colour of a football game in the colonnaded, Colosseum-like Harvard Stadium she also often attended. Both Reredos and Stadium were visual backdrops which, even in our era of the giant video screen, retain their force and conviction. Well, central to many of today's presentations is the idea that faith and beauty went hand in hand for Isabella, and so I like to think that she saw more than simply medieval pageantry and Gothic spectacle in the liturgy here. For Anglo-Catholics, then and now, the splendour of the liturgy is a gateway to the divine and an invitation to holiness. But, as you will see at choral evensong later, the incense does continue to swirl around the sanctuary here, the sanctuary that was so beautified by Mrs. Gardner's screen, as a reminder that we offer the very best of ourselves to God as our prayers rise like the incense to heaven. If you know the Santucci biography, you will know that he offers there a rather, shall we say, elaborate scheme for understanding what he sees as the significance of the screen and its details. In what follows, I will rely on the rather more sober account given in the 1975 Guidebook to the Church by Mark Wernola. The screen itself is in two parts. We've already seen this photo, and I'm grateful to Brother James for showing it to me some time ago. The lower part, along with the altar itself, as we see here, is by John Sturgis, the architect of the church, and was in use by 1883. The upper portion was designed by Sir Ernest George and Harold Peto, carved in England and unveiled on Easter Eve, 1891. At the top of the screen stand the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Archangel Gabriel, the scene being the Annunciation. At the next level down, from left to right, we have St. George the Martyr with armour and lance, St. Barbara, Virgin and Martyr, crowned and holding the tower in which she was confined, St. Francis of Assisi in friar's habit with a cross and holding the rule of his order, St. Augustine wearing bishop's mitre, holding pastoral cross in one hand and a burning heart in the other as a symbol of his fiery zeal, in Wernola's words, St. Teresa of Avila holding flowers, and St. Sebastian, martyr, stripped and bound. And here just a slightly different perspective on those saints: George, Barbara, Francis, Augustine, Teresa, Sebastian. The lowest tier shows Christ crucified in the centre, the focal point of devotion and prayer for the priest standing at the altar celebrating Mass. Christ is flanked, per the Gospel, by his mother and St. John, the beloved disciple. From left to right, the other figures are St. Elizabeth of Hungary with roses and an angel. The centre panel, as we've already seen. And then on the right, another angel and St. Isabella of France. The significance of that one probably needs no further explanation. But I will make one further observation here. Wernola, in his guidebook, says St. Isabella was canonised in 1521, but appears in no Anglican calendar. And this is an opportunity to say that the very purpose of Anglo-Catholicism is to point beyond itself, to insist that the Church of England, and by extension the other provinces of the Anglican Communion, including this one, are indeed a part of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, Reformed, yes, but also Catholic. This was and is the animating vision of the Church of the Advent, and I suspect, although I can't prove, that it animated Isabella also and was a significant factor in her willingness to buy medieval religious art before it became commonplace in the United States to do so. By donating a screen which deliberately looked back to the medieval inheritance, Isabella was honouring this animating vision. What the Advent Reredos offered her was the opportunity to reverse the order of things to which she was becoming accustomed. Somebody who was used to collecting religious art to display in a museum is here commissioning a new work to adorn and beautify the house of God. When I stand in front of the Advent Reredos and my mind wanders in a way that it shouldn't when I'm celebrating Mass, I quite often find myself thinking of the 15th century retabler with scenes of the Passion, which stands in the cloister adjacent to the Spanish chapel in the museum, though the catalogue tells us that was purchased in 1897, so in fact the Advent screen was in place first. Mrs. Gardner made other benefactions to the Advent, but at this point it becomes harder to separate fact, tradition, and myth with any degree of certainty. And I will therefore very quickly show you a couple of examples of these and then end briefly with a couple of illustrations from our archive. The 1944 centenary history of the parish includes as an appendix a lengthy list of gifts and memorials. In one section, that lists 2 antique chairs as being the gift of Mrs. Gardner. These might be the chairs which flank the bishop's throne on the north side of the high altar sanctuary, as they are listed straight after it in the appendix. That's then in closer detail. 12 pages later, there is another reference to 2 antique chairs, this time with the further detail from the Barberini Palace, Rome, circa 1575 to 1625, and again, the gift of Mrs. Gardner. It's unclear whether this listing is a duplication of the first, and whether these 2 chairs are in fact those referred to in either of those locations. We only have 2, we certainly don't have 4. If anyone here knows more about those than I do, you can see them upstairs, then do please let me know. Moving further into parish traditions, in the archive there is a photo showing the Lady Chapel fully decorated with the undated and unsigned inscription, "The lace, a gift of Mrs. Gardner." The lace still exists in the archive, now in an extremely fragile condition, but we do not know for certain if the attribution is correct. And then just to add to the confusion, there is another piece of lace that also bears the unofficial title, the Gardner lace, and that may be seen on the altar in the All Saints Chapel today. The same is true of an altar frontal, shown in use here in a photo from the centenary history. It also survives in an equally fragile state, likely beyond repair. It's known in the parish as the Gardner frontal, and once again, unverifiable tradition attributes the donation to her. A modern replica of this and a cope to go with it was made some years ago, and again that's in use on the high altar today, so you can see that modern replica when you go upstairs. Finally, Isabella appears several times in service registers and similar books in our archive, and I'm hugely grateful to Deacon Daphne Noyes for making me aware of these and sharing her knowledge of the archive with me. Here are just a handful of examples. The communicant's roll from 1879, one of the baptism registers showing that Isabella was godmother or sponsor in the language of the time to Lawrence Coolidge at his baptism here on May the 16th, 1905. The burial register showing her funeral service here and subsequent burial at Mount Auburn Cemetery. We also have a copy of her will indicating, as we've already heard, that she left $5,000 to the Church of the Advent, an approximate value of $95,000 in today's money. And then finally, and somewhat intriguingly, an extract from the service register for 1902 showing that Father Van Allen, 6th rector of the parish, celebrated midnight mass at Fenway Court on Christmas Eve that year. Mrs. Gardner, it would appear, was not above private masses in the luxury of her own home. And so this is an incredibly brief whistle-stop tour, but I hope it does just give a sense of the fact that the connections between the Church of the Advent and Isabella Stewart Gardner were indeed many and multifaceted. Thank you.